Welcome to the Region Free Gamers podcast. Today, we're planting seeds, tilling fields, and getting some potpourri. Know what I'm saying?
Actually, no, Paul. I don't.
Oh.
Well, howdy, folks, and welcome back to another episode of the Region Free Gamers podcast. My name is Arnaldo. I'll be your host for this lovely episode. Before we get started, one, thank you all so much for listening. Thank you all so much for taking the time to interact with us every time you do so. But please, if you can, and if you enjoy what you hear, even if you don't enjoy what you hear, go on iTunes, give us a rating and a review. We love hearing from you guys, and this is the best way for other people to find us and us to sort of keep growing as a show. So can't tell you how much it helps us out. If you want to do something else for us, go check out our podcast, check us out on all our other stuff, but rate and review is number one always. With that out of the way, as I try to do it as quickly as possible, let me undo one of the straps of my overalls so I can calmly introduce you to my two amazing co-hosts for this episode. First up, out of the East Coast, the best farmhand in the land. His name is Ozzy. How you doing, Ozzy?
Well, I've been up since 5 a.m. milking the cows and tilling the soil, so I already have my farmer's tan.
Yeah, it's always important to water your cows and milk your crops or something.
Perfect delineation between my arms and my overalls.
And out of the West Coast, joining us for the first time ever on the Region Free Gamers, which always makes me very excited when we get new people in, the number one member of FarmersOnly.com. Let me introduce you to James Moeller, a.k.a. Klutch Kitten Gaming. How you doing, James?
Doing so well, man. I am from Oregon, though, so I've been up since 5:30 tilling my marijuana crops. Is that okay for this show, or is that an issue?
No, that's perfectly fine. And also, I think that's going to be the new cash crop in the new Harvest Moon game, so it makes perfect sense.
Probably.
Except they'll call it something...
Harvest Moon.
Yeah, they'll call it something stupid, like Magic Herb or something like that.
They'll make sure there's a warning at the beginning of the game,
yeah.
So...
It's funny because you can't really grow tobacco in Harvest Moon, if I recall correctly. So
I don't think you can.
Yeah, so I don't think that would also go hand in hand. I think it's probably because Harvest Moon is probably not set in the South.
I know.
I don't know. It just doesn't strike me as a very southern type of setting.
Yeah.
Mineral town. Seems to me more of like, I don't know, Japanese or maybe Midwest in the U.S. perhaps.
Yeah,
let's call it Midwest.
Yeah,
I would say Midwest.
Here's the thing. I'm surprised that nobody's ever made like a parody Harvest Moon game where it's all about growing like I don't know, barley and wheat and rye and like making your own sort of illegal moonshine or something like that.
You can just make beer. Why don't you just make illegal? Just make beer, dude.
I played a beer making game, like a home brewing game on my phone before, and I know there was like literally a weed game recently that came out. It was I thought about doing it for the show because it was an indie game, but I was like,
hell yeah,
I don't know if I want to make a dank purple kush and talk about that on the show, so I didn't end up doing it. But
you've had to edit a lot of air horns into your podcast.
So it was a homebrew, James. That's pretty awesome.
That's right.
I remember back in the day there used to be a tycoon game for everything, or a sim game for everything, and it was just some of the most strangest things. And now, for some reason, I don't know, the 20-year itch seems to be hitting. It seems to be coming back.
Yeah,
and now
I think
things like PC building simulator in your PC.
Yep. There is wasn't there like a YouTuber game like that where it was like you'd essentially like it was a simulation game of you trying to become like a viral YouTuber.
Yeah. Like, you know, like influencer story or something.
That's right.
Stuff like that.
Are you talking about the Honey Pop games? Is that
it's probably the Honey Pop games.
That is one of them, but those are adult oriented. But there was just one where you're just like, I just want to be a YouTuber, and you like have to like make your videos and edit them and like release them and stuff.
James, I think the Honey Pop games is like that's an adult, YouTuber.
Okay.
So that might be a different kind of YouTuber.
I didn't realize that. Thank you.
Oh my god, it's been a while since I've hosted, and I'm realizing how much I love it now.
No, it's this other they're Apple, developers, so they're usually on iOS and stuff. I forgot their name, Simago or something, or
Zynga or something like that.
No, not Zynga. But in any case, now we have things like, we used to aspire to be roller coaster tycoons, and now we aspire to be influencers on YouTube. So I guess the times have changed a bit, and
just a little bit.
Yeah, there's just no better way to show the cracks of time falling into your bones. So, God, I got too depressive too quick.
I mean, that brings up like old school gaming with Zoo Tycoon, where like you jack up the prices of bathrooms to $20 a pop. And I just remember those being such fun times. I feel like it doesn't work quite as well with like PC Simulator or building a PC in a game. So I think we should bring some of those tycoons back.
Yeah, it's not
I think
as exciting.
They're coming back.
They are.
Yeah, that's
I
good.
think there was a roller coaster tycoon that released for the Switch, and I think it was like
no, but that one was terrible.
Yeah, it was really bad.
If you want to play a modern roller coaster tycoon game, and I know that we're off the rails already, but Planet Coaster by Frontier Games. I mean, they're the ones who are kind of doing the new sort of tycoon games, and so right now they've been working on a new Zoo. Planet Zoo or something like that, whatever it's called. And so it's kind of like a spiritual successor to Zoo Tycoon, which I know had a lot of fans back in the day. I never played Zoo Tycoon. I was always a roller coaster tycoon type of guy, and I did make impossible roller coasters and then launch my poor guess.
That was the best part, was making the roller coaster that you knew was going to kill everybody.
Yes.
And watching it like explode.
I didn't kill people that often on roller coasters tycoon. It was only when I was fed up,
gotcha.
which doesn't speak very well of me. Sorry guys, we don't endorse any of this. No, I would just make very, very complicated roller coasters. I would try to see how extreme I could make them, but no one wanted to go in it. It was like,
I see.
As soon as they saw they were gonna go into the line, and they were just like, oh nope,
nope, out of here.
I'm not doing this. Those games were ultra fun. We do gotta make an episode about this.
I know these games. They were really entertaining. But to get back on track a little bit, James, since this is your first time on the Region Free Gamers podcast, I have to do the obligatory couple of questions. So
don't make it like it's such a chore, man. Come on.
Listeners can get to know you. I know this is the worst part. Everybody loves this part. But it's funny because this is a little different. Usually when we do these, we haven't had a lot of interaction with people before they come on the show in person, sort of in like talking to them. But I've met you in person before, and you've also interviewed me and Paul for your podcast.
Yes, sir. I just don't like Ozzy. That's why he hasn't been on.
No one likes me. I'm the crank of the group. So
crank of the group.
But so I think it's going to be interesting if any of your listeners come in to listen to this, because they've already maybe heard us talking a little bit to you. But what I wanted to know was, we always ask this question, is what are some of your first experiences with video games? Like, what were some of the video games that got you into video gaming?
Yeah, this is always such an interesting question, because I ask it of my guests when I have them on, but it's like I don't always think about it for myself.
The tables have turned.
The tables have turned. But I was thinking, my parents weren't big console people, but we did have some PCs, and because video games were they didn't think they were evil, but because video games were bad, we were supposed to be outside playing and getting our energy out. The games that we got were mostly Learning Company games growing up. So it was a lot of like Oregon Trail 3, Operation Neptune, games that made you like work to play the game. But those actually made me start liking games more. And then from there, I would be going over to my neighbor's house, who actually had the consoles. So he had a SNES, he had a computer with the likes of Backyard Soccer, and we'd play Super Mario World and all that sort of stuff. And it was just like the Learning Company games, and then all of his stuff on the SNES and PS2 and onward that kind of got me into gaming originally.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and how do your parents feel now that you have a gaming podcast after all their hard effort and not making you play games?
I think they're very supportive of me. They whenever they ask about my my podcast, they first of all, I think podcasts kind of confuse them a little bit, but they're very supportive, and they're like, we don't understand the whole gaming thing, but that's awesome you like it. That's awesome you're doing something you enjoy. So I think now they're cool with it, but back in the day, Yeah, it was mostly just learning company games. Although somehow, I don't know how it happened, but we got some games like Lego Racers 1 and 2. I don't know if you...
Oh, I love Lego Racers.
Yeah,
those were good, yeah.
And like, we didn't have to do any math equations or learn history to play them, so I don't know how in the world they came into our house, but...
No, that was, I remember one of the first PC games I ever got was Lego Island, and I loved that game so much.
They were kind of sandbox games before their time.
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't look great, but for a child or someone that was, developing, I think it presented a lot of opportunities to really do fun things with it. And I think that was kind of in the spirit of Lego.
Yeah. But did you ever get so I know you did a lot of educational gaming. Did you ever get the sort of secret you do learn, but you're not really it's more fun than actual learning, like Carmen Sandiego or Pajama Sam or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Carmen Sandiego was definitely one of those games. I mean, most of those games I do remember as being more fun than not. Because I mean, the people who were developing them weren't trying to oppress kids with learning this stuff. They were obviously trying to make it fun. So, I did enjoy them. Oregon Trail 3 was definitely positive. Operation Neptune was this one where you were operating this sub, and that one was the math equation one, but that one was always fun because you could shoot, you had a ammunition of these ink pellets that you could shoot these fish as you go deeper and deeper into the ocean. And so that one was really fun. I can't really remember many others offhand, but yeah, they were good games despite, I don't know, feeling a little bit like school. But
So when do you recall actually getting into other types of games that were non-educational? How did that process come about?
Yeah, I don't know what the exact timeline was, but I would probably attribute a lot of it to going over to my friends, playing again, I think Backyard Soccer, and there was a Scooby-Doo game on the PC back in the day that I remember playing with him. All I remember is how fun it was to give Scooby snacks to Scooby, because I mean, obviously that's fun. And then, lots of SNES. And then I remember kind of a heyday of playing lots of Need for Speed on the PS2. I remember playing a Shrek game on the PS2. There's lots of random memories that are kind of swirling around.
The quality seems to be all over the place.
All over the place. But we did play, Super Mario World, so that was always a classic on the SNES.
Yeah.
That was the main SNES game I remember playing with him. But I mean, that you could buy the entire console for that game, so I don't think it was too bad just playing that.
No,
but
absolutely not. One thing I was going to say, because we've mentioned it already, but for those of you who don't know, you do have your own podcast, the Klutch Kitten Gaming podcast.
I do.
And just as a quick overview, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm wrong about a lot of things. Basically, the conceit or the main drive of the podcast is you play an indie game for 5 hours, and then you sort of give your take on whether people should buy it and play it or avoid it. Is that correct?
Can you say that once more? I'm going to record it so I can use that for my intro. Is that cool? Yeah, that is the main conceit.
Okay.
Yeah, the main conceit is basically just reviewing a single indie game each episode, and basically telling listeners whether or not I think it's worth their time and money to actually play it.
Okay. And so I guess from that, my main question would be, especially based on what you're telling us, you grew up playing and the kinds of games that sort of shaped you as you were coming up, what sort of piqued your interest in indie games specifically? What was it about indie games that made it so you wanted to talk about them this much?
Yeah, I liked this question because it got me thinking more. I think a lot of it actually stemmed from almost necessity. When I decided that I wanted to do a podcast, it was okay, I want at least a little bit of a niche, and there's a couple limitations that I have. I work a full-time job, so I obviously have limited hours, so I can't play a 100-hour game every single week. That's just not feasible. And then I have a life outside of games, which means I actually have bills to pay, and I like to do some things outside of just gaming that cost money, so I can't spend $60 on a game every single week. So that was part of the whole thing, where it's okay, indie games are usually cheaper and they're usually smaller, so they're more bite-sized. I feel they're feasible to play. And then honestly, through that, I've really grown to love indie as a concept more for gaming.
Okay.
And it's kind of hard because indie's a little bit obscure might be the wrong word, but in terms of like there's huge indie developers like Insomniac, which actually they're not indie anymore, but they used to be, and they're developing these gigantic games that everyone knows about. And then there's the one-man shops like Concerned Ape, who did Stardew, and there's like such a span of what indie is. But I think the concept of indie being this way of development where you're not being controlled by a board of directors who are just trying to make the most money. It's about passion and ingenuity in a lot of these games. So I think that's what has kind of kept me coming back for more indies, because it's like, yeah, there's a lot of garbage indies, and I'm not saying at all that AAAs are bad. There's a lot of amazing AAA games that aren't just there to be greedy, but like so many indie games take it a step beyond, because they don't necessarily have the backing of this huge amount of money or a huge team, but there's all this passion and man, that's the only word I can think of right now, but like passion and ingenuity in their games that just creates these amazing products. Like Supergiant Games, they have multiple different games, Transistor, Bastion, Hades. Now they're like all these different genres that they've excelled in with this amazing art style and kind of narrative quality to them. And I could go on for so long, so I'll stop talking about it. But
yeah, and I mean it's I like what you're saying makes a ton of sense to me. I mean, for example, I'm thinking about it now as like indie has sort of become like this catch-all term for me. Like it's sort of abstract at this point. Yeah. And I think I'm not very good with words, so I think Ozzy will have to help me out a little bit in this description. But at least for me, it's an exciting time for indie games for me, because it feels like for the first time in a while, especially in the gaming space, like you don't know what to expect now. You know, when there was a space in time when every new big release, I was like, oh, okay, I think I know what this game is going to be even before I really sit down and play it. Like, I think there's certain patterns that big developers are following and sort of mechanics that are baked into most games just by default. And now with indie games, it's just like, I don't know what the next thing that's going to come out is. I remember this weekend people were, you know, not to date the episode already, but the new Link's Awakening is coming out, and I've heard just as many people talking about Sayonara Wild Hearts and Untitled Goose Game as I have people talking about Link's Awakening, and that's crazy, you know, like the fact that
there's the element of innovation, which is very important, but there's also the element of the tools have finally caught up with this aficionados, to the point that these are people that grew up loving the same games that we loved, and they're trying to either recreate the feel of those games that we loved or iterate upon them in a way that hasn't been done in years because they were not seen as marketable anymore. And I think that's what's particularly exciting, because you have nostalgic games, but you also have games that really take you in very different directions, kind of like, let's say, Valhalla, you know, cyberpunk bartender simulator, you know, which meshes the dating sim aspect or the visual novel aspect with a kind of bartending, you know, kind of sim. So it's really interesting, because I feel like the field has now been leveled to the point that you can actually get a very good game, you know, by just one person, you know, something like a Stardew Valley or something like an Axiom Verge or
an Undertale.
Or Undertale. And, you know, the only thing that it requires of you, of course it requires talent, but the only thing it requires you is passion and commitment. And these games take a large number of years. Something like Hyper Light Drifter takes a large number of years to make. But it's all done by one person, and so you have this very singular vision, and so it's a return of sorts to the old times, you know, in the late 80s and the early 90s, I mean, even before that, but where you had 2, 3, 4 person teams, and they were the ones that would make the games that you grew to love. You know, something like Ninja Turtles in Time was probably done by like 4 or 5 people, and one of those was the composer and sound producer. So that's what I think has really made a big impact. It's not necessarily the fact that indie as a whole has become a concept. It's just that it's really proselytized. It's really democratized the tools of game development. And now it used to be that the only thing you could use back in the day if you were an indie developer was like 3D Game Studio or something like that. Now there's just such a wealth of different types of engines and different ways of making your own game. And there's so much literature out there about making your own game, which didn't exist before.
Yeah.
That really, it only takes dedication and commitment if you really want to make a game.
Yeah. And I think, the people coming up now who are seeing all these, 1, 2, 3-man teams, I think that sort of sparks you as a creative, right? Like when you see this many people doing it, it shows you like, yeah, this isn't impossible. Like I should try to do this. I should sort of dip my toe in this and see how I can, make this work.
Without getting into too much of a digression, but James, you may be able to speak to this. And I think that's where something like your podcast really comes into play. I think the biggest issue right now is a problem of discovery. There are so many. The moment that you lower the barrier of entry, you're going to have a floodgate being open of releases and products. And the problem that we have right now, and I am seeing it now on the Switch. The Switch started out as being an indie machine, and now it's turning into something that needs more curation. It's also happened on the PS4. I mean, let's not even talk about Steam because everything almost goes on Steam. And so, even recently, Good Old Games or GOG.com got into a bit of a tussle because they rejected one of the games. And it turns out that it was a really good game. And they said, well, it's curated. Eventually, they had to backtrack and say, no, we're going to allow it. But it really speaks to the concept and question of, at what point do we need a gatekeeper? And I think in that respect, James, you serve as kind of a gatekeeper because whoever listens to you will know, is this worth my time or not? And you're always trying to find and discover new developers. But my concern here is that there are going to be very good games that are going to be made with hard labor, and then it's going to take 3-4 years of someone's life, and then they're just going to disappear. And so what I'm seeing, it's almost like, it used to be that this would apply to like writers. You would write your novel, and this would be the novel that you have in your heart, and it would be amazing, but no one would read it, and it would only be discovered years and years later. And that's what concerns me, that there could be very talented people that may just have a one-off game, not succeed, and then just get out of games altogether. So that's something that I'm very concerned about. I mean, and there are also a lot of different circumstances. I mean, if you can't make your money back on the game that you've made, or if you can't be profitable, and I mean, how are you going to pay your bills? I'm thinking about someone like, Thomas Happ, who did Axiom Verge. He put a lot of his, time and years into that game, but then, he had personal family issues, and so he hasn't really been able to focus on developing a new game. So it's kind of bittersweet in a way how, games are becoming more and more prevalent, but at the same time, it's becoming harder to discover them.
Yeah, you totally hitting the nail on the head there. There's so much content out there. It's just like I'm doing a single podcast every single week covering a single game, but there's like, hundreds.
And you still feel like you're falling behind.
Oh yeah, so much so. My backlog is huge. To be quite honest, it's going to sound super dumb and I guess naive, but like when I started the podcast, I was like, man, I hope I have enough games to keep going every single week. You're laughing. And now I'm like, okay, I have 10 games that I could play this week or more that are already in my libraries. And I don't even have to go out and buy more games. And there's just too many to play. And the issue is there's so many good ones. And then there's a lot of this clutter of bad games because there are a lot of just junky games that people kind of just throw out there to, hopefully rake in a little bit of money. And then those end up clouding out these amazing games. And like recently, Ozzy, you talked a lot about Blazing Chrome. I wouldn't have heard about that if it wasn't for your podcast, for RFG. And I think Arnaldo also mentioned it as well, but it's like, a game like that I wouldn't have heard about otherwise because it's just getting lost in this huge ocean of games that are out there.
I mean, have you ever thought, James, about doing something like, since you can't cover everything, just kind of like a quick fire type of like, okay, these games, yes, no, or something like that. Kind of like a
weekly
quick 30-second review.
I would love to do something like that. I think I'm always trying to look for ways to kind of increase the value that I can provide with the podcast. And that's definitely one way to possibly do that. It's just it's such a difficult thing because we only have so much time in our days. We all, are working, and it's like, I can't cover all these things, but I want to because there's so many good things that you don't want people to miss. And like Valhalla being a perfect example. I didn't play that until earlier this year, and that was an amazing game. And when I put out an episode about it, there's a ton of people who have never heard about it before. But it's like, that's probably for so many other games, including that one. But
yeah, absolutely. I will say one thing, because I'm really enjoying sort of this line that we're going down, and that is, like you said, there's so many games now that it's hard for you to even decide which ones you're doing for a specific episode. And you talked about a problem of like more bad games being sort of in the market or in the sphere now. Mm-hmm. Do you sometimes feel because I know, obviously, at least for me, like when we talk about certain things, we've obviously talked about good things, bad things, good games, bad games, but I feel like it's so much more engaging and so much more entertaining for people when you're talking about an experience you enjoy.
Yeah.
Do you feel sometimes inclined to talk about games that you know are going to be good, or that you have more of a feeling that you're going to enjoy? Or do you really just try to be like, this is the game, like, let's go into it blind. If I like it or if I don't, I'll just say what I feel?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I totally feel that way. So the way I kind of grade my games, I guess, instead of doing a, scale of 1 to 10 at the end of my episodes, I basically say, essentially, should you buy it? Should you wait for a sale, or should you basically leave it alone? And, when I start playing too many games where I tell people to leave it alone and not touch it, it starts feeling bad because I hate just spending 20 minutes railing on a game. But I also, if it's a bad game, I'm not going to not tell people that.
Of course,
it's not. I'm not being paid by any of these developers to review their game well. So it's like, I want to give an accurate picture. And so that does play into the games I choose each week. Luckily, a lot of the games I look at have already been out for a little bit, at least. I try to keep the games I look at within the past 2 years, usually, of recency. But usually I have at least an idea of whether or not a game should be good. Sometimes my opinion does differ from what the popular opinion is, but usually it's like, okay, there's a pretty good sense of what this game is before I go into it. Something I've been kind of working through recently is I've started getting games either before they're out or like just as they're coming out. And that has presented a unique scenario for myself. I know, game reviewers have been dealing with this for forever, but I've started having to really like, okay, I have to start putting many hours into the game before I realize whether or not it's good. I can't just look at some meta scores and be like, okay, I think this will probably be a good game. I have to go into it and kind of cross my fingers and hope that it's decent. Otherwise, it's like, sorry, go ahead.
You're now becoming like one of the earliest sort of voices. Like you can't sort of cross-reference what you think versus what other people have said and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things that interests me a lot, because reviewers, their early impressions will really shape the dialectic and the discourse over the game, and it can, make or break a game.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And so if you're overly critical, but you're not being fair to the game, then that's probably going to impact the game in many more magnitudes than someone that reviews it 1 week after the fact.
Yeah.
So there's kind of a great responsibility hoisted upon you.
Yeah.
And for me in particular,
don't worry, just you got to destroy the dreams and hopes of a very young developer that will never go into gaming again, because Klutch Kitten Gaming said, wait for a sale. 15 years from now, some
YouTuber will point to your review of some game that it's a hidden gem now, and you said it was okay at the time, and they'll make fun of you. It'll be fine.
I'm pretty sure that there are every single reviewer out there, every single journalist out there has a review in their backlog that they wish they could take back.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Probably. And I mean,
trust me.
That's a great point, Ozzy. I think it's such an interesting thing. I mean, I don't have like millions of listeners trusting on my reviews to be like buying whatever their next game is every week.
Yeah.
I have a much smaller audience than that, but you still feel a responsibility to give an accurate picture of what's going on. And there was one game I remember reviewing, and when I have a game that I don't like, I try to be as positive as I can about the things that are at least adequate or decent.
Yeah.
Like maybe the art's okay, but the gameplay just is shit. Like I don't know what it is, but there was this one game where I did not like the game at all, but this was something where these two developers had just quit their jobs a couple years prior, and like they put a lot of time and I'm sure a lot of money into it. And it's like, even though not a ton of people are listening to this review, I still feel bad for saying bad things when, these people's livelihoods are in this game. And so, yeah, there's always that kind of balance where you don't want to just completely shit on whatever you're talking about, but you also have a responsibility to your viewers and your listeners to present accurate information. So
absolutely. So I think with that, we've gotten a good picture of James and what he's doing, and now we're going to subject him to our podcast format, and we're going to talk about Harvest Moon. This was an interesting topic. I don't think I don't know about you, Ozzy, when we started the show, Harvest Moon was not like a game that I thought would be good podcast content. Like, I don't know if that's unfair to say.
That's because you probably didn't play it.
I don't know. It's just like, I have played some Harvest Moon. I've never been a huge Harvest Moon guy. Like, it's just not the type of gameplay that I'm super into. But here's one thing is, if somebody had been like, do you want to play a farming RPG? I would have been like, no. But apparently a lot of people do, and it's, people love this sort of thing, and I can see the appeal. I can. So I think what we're going to try to do in this episode is just go through a little bit of history and talk about some of the bigger games in the series. Before we get started, I did want to do a little rundown on the history of Harvest Moon, or at least one particular aspect of it. One, because I was not aware of it, and I thought it was extremely interesting. So if you guys will indulge me for a second, one of the things I learned when I was researching this is that apparently Harvest Moon is no longer Harvest Moon. It's Story of Seasons now, but there is also a Harvest Moon. Harvest Moon has now sort of bifurcated into these two separate series, and I was so confused because in my ignorant brain, I thought that Harvest Moon was a Natsume property. I've always associated Harvest Moon with Natsume. They've been publishing the games in English for, I mean, at this point, like almost 2 decades.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not. It's actually a property of initially developed by Victor Interactive Software, which was acquired by Marvelous Entertainment in 2003. So what had ended up happening is, up until 2013, Natsume was handling all the English releases and all the English translation and distribution in America. And then Marvelous decided they wanted to hand that distribution over to their American distributor, which is Xseed Games. I love Xseed. I had no idea that Xseed was a distributor for Marvelous. I
didn't realize that either until this episode.
Yeah, exactly. So this is already blowing my mind immediately. And so what happens is they split, basically, Marvelous goes to Natsume and they're like, we're going to take over distributing and translation of all Harvest Moon games from now on. Xseed's going to handle that. And Natsume turns around and is like, that's cool, but we also own the Harvest Moon name. So that's not what you're going to do. And so Marvelous is like, well, we're just going to change the name to Story of Seasons, and we're just going to assume that people are going to understand that it's still Harvest Moon.
They still don't. I mean, and so what you have now is you have Natsume publishing Harvest Moon, and they're basically knockoffs. They're like complete, cheap cash-ins of what Harvest Moon used to be, and so they really don't have any type of charm or heart or soul. And it's really a shame, because to the common person that may have loved, I don't know, Harvest Moon 64, Back to Nature, they say, okay, well, I want to try a new Harvest Moon game, or a farming game, and I don't necessarily want to do one of these app games or something.
Yeah.
And they try Harvest Moon, Light of whatever, I don't know what the name is, and they see this and they say, what has happened to this?
Yeah.
And they are suddenly put off by what they see as a decline in quality.
Yep.
Independently of the whole split, I do think the Harvest Moon did have a decline in quality.
Yeah.
I do have a lot of opinions on the art style and the way that Harvest Moon kind of went after it, went to the Wii. Around that period of Tree of Tranquility, Harvest Moon sort of diverged, where it didn't really know what its identity would be. That's the same time that we started seeing like Rune
Factory?
Yeah.
Rune Factory, and we started seeing Innocent Life, Harvest Moon, Futuristic Harvest Moon, things like that, where just Harvest Moon was spreading its tentacles everywhere, and it posted the Harvest Moon as well. And so the mainline franchise, it just didn't really know how to evolve. And, without getting too ahead of myself, that's where something like Stardew Valley really did well, because they knew what worked and took it back to basics without really trying to do too much and trying to present, I don't know, a zoo or something like that as an innovative play mechanic or something.
Yeah. So they took it back to nature is what you're saying.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and so I think that the Harvest Moon name, it's unfortunate that it's still being used, but not in a good way. And hopefully, eventually people kind of, warm up to Story of Seasons. But I think, the idea of Story of Seasons, I mean, that name is so different from Harvest Moon that I don't see people necessarily making an association between one and the other. And it's really kind of a shame.
I do remember seeing like the first Story of Seasons game that Xseed published on the 3DS and being so confused, because I was like, this looks exactly like Harvest Moon. Like, what is this?
Well, there was one Harvest Moon that released that was almost like a Minecraft clone or something like that.
I think if you look at the catalog of Harvest Moon post 2013, it's sad. It's
pretty
not
sad.
Great.
Wasn't that one from?
But
sorry,
it is what it is. And if you're a hardcore fan, then you will know what you have to look for.
What were you saying, James?
I was saying, wasn't the kind of Minecraft one of those from Natsume after they kind of split off? Wasn't that the first one? And people didn't like it because it was like a shitty version of Minecraft. I'm pretty sure,
Because basically what's happened, and Ozzy pointed to this, and this is like one of those things that I, for example, don't really think of as just like a casual game player, but it's the fact that like I really associate, especially early on. Now I'm a lot better about it, but early on in my video game life, like the name on the box is the name I associate with the game, right? So like the publisher for me in a lot of cases was like my link to that video game. So like when I thought Harvest Moon before, I was like, oh, it's a Natsume thing, like obviously, because their name's always on the box. And so it's a really good example of like, when you strip away the development team, especially if it's a development team that's been working on a series for a long time, how you can just rip the soul right out of a game and make it something like unrecognizable to the people who grew up really loving that game. Because now I think what Natsume does is they just farm out the next Harvest Moon game to whatever developer they feel like.
Well, I mean, it's just that Natsume was never a developer.
Yeah,
I mean, they were just a localizer.
Yeah.
They were the same as, let's say, Working Designs. You know, they didn't really do the development themselves. It was just they did the work of localizing.
Yeah.
And of course, there's value in that. But in terms of actually making a game, I don't think they really have the capabilities to do that. So they just outsource it.
Yeah. But so I thought that was super interesting because now what you're seeing is basically every Harvest Moon game 2013 backwards is now a Story of Seasons game. And then every Harvest Moon game that's still being produced today is like technically Harvest Moon, but not really, like in name only, essentially.
It's so confusing how it is now. Yeah.
It's
what's
it's
in a name? What's in a name?
Exactly.
Arnie, as Shakespeare would say.
Yeah. So basically, that whole line was to establish like the games we'll be talking about are all called Harvest Moon, but they're technically part of Story of Seasons at this point. Mm-hmm. That doesn't really matter, but I just wanted to clear that up for historical purposes. I want give that information because I think it's important for people to understand that sort of stuff.
Yeah. All right. So let's take a break, Arnie, before we get into the first one.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take a quick break. And we're back. So, let's dive into some Harvest Moon, guys. Let's plant some seeds. Let's harvest some crops.
It's amazing that we still haven't talked about turnips or eggplants or anything, related to actual farm work.
Let's shear some sheep. Let's marry one of the 6 women that I'm allowed to marry by law.
Listen, one of them, if we're talking about Friends of Mineral Town, one of them was the harvest goddess. So I don't.
That is true.
Sorry, buddy, you're not gonna get that on the first go around.
That'd be pretty sweet.
It's 5 for you.
All right, so Harvest Moon, here we go. So the game series was created by Yasuhiro Wada. Harvest Moon was his first game concept 3 years after he got into working at Victor Interactive, which handled development for the majority of Harvest Moon games. He has said that he wants people to find happiness by going back to nature, and you can really see that as the main conceit of Harvest Moon. Like if you play any Harvest Moon game, I mean, we'll get into this as we talk about the individual games, but it basically boils down to you've inherited or you've obtained a rundown farm and you have to work to sort of bring it back to life and make it successful again. So I can really see that sort of philosophy in the games that he's making.
And I think he said before, I couldn't find the interview yesterday, but I read it before, that he built the concept around his nostalgia for when he was a kid growing up in the countryside. And you could really see that in these games because there's always a sense of, kind of recapturing your childhood and kind of reconnecting with your childhood memories. That's something that's very strong, at least in Back to Nature. But it always starts, Harvest Moon games always start with some sort of tragedy. Your grandpa probably died, most likely, your grandpa left you a farm. And so it's always around the concept of kind of revisiting something that you once knew, but that you've kind of walked away from for a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So with that in mind, I do want to ask you guys, like, what was your introduction to Harvest Moon? Even if it wasn't a Harvest Moon game, like, what was your introduction to the sort of mechanics of Harvest Moon? So, James, why don't you go first?
Yeah, Friends of Mineral Town was my first introduction to the game, or to the series and just concept as a whole. And that's what made me really love the whole farming RPG kind of style of game. And I can't remember exactly when I played it, but I remember really enjoying the farming, enjoying selling the crops and doing kind of the main cycle of the game, but not fully getting into the social aspect of it. I don't know if I just didn't realize it was there, or it was one of those things where it's like, okay, I guess I can talk to people, but what does it do? So it wasn't really until I went to Stardew and like really got into that hardcore and then realized, I was like, oh man, I'm so dumb. I needed to do all of these things. And like since then I've kind of gotten back into Friends of Mineral Town, but yeah, that was kind of where my introduction was. And I think it really clicked right off the bat in terms of like the purpose of the game. Kind of like you guys were saying, it's like going back to nature, kind of going back to these childhood roots. When you start these games, it's like, oh man, this is comfortable. You're going to this broken down farm, but it's like, oh man, this is comfortable to do. I can fix up this farm. I can make money and make friends. And it's all very, happy in the sense of what you're doing and, what you're accomplishing.
Okay. What about you, Ozzy? I know you have a troubled history with Harvest Moon, and you're still recovering to this day. But why don't you tell me about it?
Let me just put it this way. The moment that I put in Stardew Valley and I went, 10 days in, I said, I'm going to put this down and I'm not going to touch it ever again. And it wasn't because it was bad. It was because it was that good. I remember when I first saw Harvest Moon was with Harvest Moon 64. Okay. And it was around 2000. Harvest Moon 64 came out in 99, if I recall correctly.
I believe you're right, yeah.
I didn't have a 64, so I couldn't really play it, but I did like the idea of a farming game. And I remember... I think one of the magazines had like a strategy guide. I think it might have been like Expert Gamer or something like that. And, they went into details about what kind of crops you had to farm and what to do in several, seasons, etc. And I don't know, that and the combination of you have a dog with you at all times and he looks really damn cute. I was like, I really dig this.
Yeah.
And I don't know what was in me at that point, but I really kind of wanted something that gave you that freedom. I think people take it for granted nowadays, but the idea of an open world in which you had the ability to do whatever you wanted on any given day was not really common, particularly in console games.
Yeah.
Most console games were pretty much straightforward affairs. You had your action, and you went from one level to the other. Eventually, we kind of moved away from levels, but it was still very much linear in nature.
Yeah.
So whenever I would see something like a Harvest Moon, where it's not an open world in the sense of what we know today to be an open world, but it is open, and you have the freedom to do whatever you want on any given day, that really appealed to me. And I remember that I was trying to look for similar games like that, and eventually Back to Nature was released, and I remember that I asked my mom to take me to Toys R Us. That's a very vivid memory. And it was like late at night, I had already come back from school, everything, I had done my homework. So I was like, hey, can we go pick up a game? And so she took me over there, and I remember it was $60. If you remember Toys R Us, they were in the box and everything. And you had to go to the counter to take it away from the box, etc. And I remember I opened it up, and the whole car ride back, I was just looking at the manual of all the things that you had to do. And I remember just being completely overwhelmed. I was like, oh my God, like, what is this? And so I remember when I started playing it, it really didn't click with me at all. I was just like, wow, like, this is a lot of work. Like, I had to clear this entire field. I had to kind of put in effort into actually getting to the fun part. And that put me off for a while, actually. And so for like a month, I didn't really play the game. And until one day I was like, you know what? I bought this game. I'm going to, try to give it a fair shot. And so I started clearing away the rubble, and I started clearing away the weeds. And eventually I had a fully tilled farm. And, when I started being able to plant my seeds, that's when the addiction had set in, because you have to wait a number of days before the seeds grow. But you put the seeds in, you water them, and the next day you see like the inklings of something that's growing, and then the next day you see a little bit more, and then it's that loop that's so addictive that is, you're always waiting for the next day. It's what they call in Civilization the one more turn syndrome.
Yeah.
That whole, let's see what happens the next day. Is it going to be raining? Is something bad going to happen? Or is there a festival? Or is it someone's birthday? Can I give someone, am I going to finally, be able to upgrade, my relationship with this bachelorette that I am wooing? And so once I started getting into the loop, I knew that I was in it. And it was interesting because when I got into that, I started talking to my cousins about it. I started talking to my friends about it, and they were all like laughing at me. And I was like, dude, I'm serious. This is the real deal. Like, I'm not kidding. And so I once took it to my cousin's house, and we were going to spend the whole weekend there at my cousin's. And we did nothing but play Harvest Moon that weekend. Nothing but play Harvest Moon. And so my cousin was like, hey, can I stay with it for a little bit? And I was like, fine. 1 week later, I come back, and this guy is like on his third year. He's already fully upgraded his whole house, and this was the guy that was like shitting on me for like saying I like this game.
Yeah.
And eventually it turned into something where it was like being passed around amongst us like it was a drug.
Yeah.
You know? And you would see like this older kids. I mean, I was like, 11 maybe at that time. And you would see like 14, 15-year-old kids. And they were like, and I was like, where's the game? It's like, oh, I lent it to this guy. And this like this older guy. I'm like, what the hell is he doing playing this game? and we would go to their door and you would see the game in the background on pause. And I was like, seriously? And I was like very shy back then, so I was like, give me my game back. I didn't want to say give me my game back, but eventually I basically never saw my game again.
Oh God.
So I know one of the questions that you're going to ask me, Arnie, is whether I finished Back to Nature, but
yes.
I couldn't because someone took it.
Oh my God, that's like the saddest story.
Yeah, someone took it. And so it wasn't until Friends of Mineral Town that I actually went back into it. But, you know, by then I had gone through a whole process of addiction and finally understanding what it was like to be addicted at a tender age of 11.
Yeah.
There's something so...
I'm just kidding, guys. To anyone that's facing addiction, I am just being facetious. I'm sorry. I was very passionate about the game. Let's not say even addiction.
Yeah. I mean, like for me, I was exposed to like the first time I remember hearing about Harvest Moon was Harvest Moon 64 back in the day, I think. And for me, it was kind of the opposite of your story, Ozzy, where I saw people playing it and I was like, this is way too much. Like I can barely handle two things at once. You're going to have me planting, watering, harvesting, taking care of animals, feeding people, trying to, get married. Like I'm 11. I want to play Tony Hawk's or something. Like I'll take a pass on this one. But as I've gotten older, like the idea of it becomes more and more appealing. And like in doing research for this episode and watching like gameplay and, sort of playing around a little bit with it myself, like I can definitely see the appeal. I can see how you would, sit down and sort of fall into this loop where you're just doing these little things every day because it's satisfying, it's satisfying to sort of start from nothing and then watch as it sort of becomes bigger and bigger and better and better and your tools get better and you become better at growing stuff and you know how to set up your animals over here and your crops over here and how you're always on top of all your chores and you realize how to spend your energy each day. Like that stuff becomes very satisfying because it gives you little victories each day. Mm-hmm. It's not like, for example, in an RPG where you're just working and working and working and working for the ultimate payoff of like beating this boss or reaching a certain level or finding a character. It's like every day you get something that you're like, I did something today. I accomplished a thing that I wanted to do, and it's going to lead to this next thing and this next thing and this next thing. And so I can't put it down until, the game's over, essentially.
Well, I mean, it's all the various, and we're going to have to get into the games. But it's all the various components of it. It's not just the fact that you're farming. Like farming is a very general term. But the fact that, for example, you start out with chickens. Yeah. And you can name your chickens. And every day you kind of have to give your chickens a little bit of love. And when you go into your sub menu, it shows you whether your chickens are doing good, whether they love you, how many hearts do they have. And so you want to develop a relationship with your animals. You can name your animals. Yep. And so you do start feeling very, intimate and close with, the various livestock that you hold. Yeah. So eventually you end up having cows, sheep, etc. You can ride your horse. Mm-hmm. You have to pick up your dog every day for the dog to be, happy. And so it's just all the various elements. And then, after a hard day of work, you have to plan your day every day. It's like what am I going to do today? Do I have plants that I need to water? I will water the seeds, etc. Yep. But then after you're done with the whole thing, it's okay. What am I gonna do in the town today? Who am I gonna speak with? Who am I gonna try to develop a relationship with? And it does feel like you're living in this town. I hate to say it because I just brought it up in one of our most recent episodes, but it's almost like Shenmue in nature. Like it's really what I wanted. And that's why for me, I played this before Shenmue, but that's why Shenmue was so, meaningful to me because it really felt like an evolution of this, even though you couldn't really plant any flowers or anything in Shenmue.
You
but
go work
it
at the
really
docks
felt like the
instead.
idea of having your own schedule and the idea of having to organize your social relationships, etc. I mean, it's something that really appealed to me back in the day. And so kind of being transplanted into this world, the games at least did a very good job of doing that, of just making you feel like you've just been plopped into this world and that you're part of it.
Something I think is so interesting with these games is that especially as an adult, I feel like it's so hard to explain to people what is so amazing about these types of games, because it's like, if I go to someone who isn't a normal gamer and they're like, oh, okay, what are you playing? If they're trying to be nice and make conversation. If I say something like, oh, I'm playing Skyrim where I'm killing people with swords and magic and all that sort of stuff, that's probably what they're expecting. They're like, oh yeah, that's a video game. But it's like, if I say, oh, I'm playing a game where I go farming and then I have a relationship with people in the town and say hi to people and remember people's birthday.
They'll be like, why?
Yeah, they're like, isn't that what you're trying to do in real life? Like, why the hell would you play that? And I feel like it's one of those games where you can't fully understand the appeal and what's so amazing about them until you at least watch or experience it for yourself.
Until you're in it.
Yeah, it like clicks in.
All right, let me get deep, if you guys will allow me.
Sure.
I think the appeal of these games, and I'm just kind of putting my own circumstances into this and my own life experiences, is that if you're someone that's shy, someone that's 11, 12 years old, and you have a hard time talking to other people, and you don't have a lot of freedom because you're in middle school, these games offer some sort of escape, because you're able to really develop social relationships without the fear of being judged, without the fear of that you're going to be laughed at or something like that, whatever kids think at that age. And so, at least to me, thinking back on it, the idea of when I was playing this game, I was 11 or so, or 12, the idea that I could develop a relationship with another girl from town, without having to go through the anxiety and nauseating fear of having to actually speak to a girl in real life. I think that really appealed to me back then. And along those same lines, you have something like The Sims, etc., where it's just kind of living out your life, but in a way that you have control over it. That, I think, is critical. The idea that you're in a setting where you can control your life and you're not facing the same repercussions that you're typically fearing in real life. That, I think, to me, is a huge part of the appeal of games like Harvest Moon. Yeah. And I don't know if I'm on a tangent here, but I that's the way I see it.
I think you're right. I think, like you said, just having that sort of controlled environment where like you can sort of, especially in that social aspect, like you were talking about, you can approach people, you can sort of talk to them, get to know them, and not have to worry about, some of these negative intricacies of social interaction that could be, daunting for anybody, really, not just like a young person, but just in general. And so I think a game like Harvest Moon, where you can, like you said, sort of organize your days and sort of create a space for yourself where you know what you're doing, you sort of, as you play, you get better at the game and you figure out, I need to do this way and this that way, and I know who I want to talk to and I know who I'm interested in and things like that. I think it's very appealing for, people to do that. And as we get into the original SNES game, which was released in 1996, I think it's important to point out to people, like we do with a lot of things when we're looking back this far, is that this was not, at least to my knowledge, this was not a tried and true concept. This was very new. People
No, absolutely not.
Didn't like, this wasn't a type of game that people had any experience with. Now, obviously not only within the Harvest Moon series and obviously successors like Stardew Valley and stuff, but I think other games take some of these mechanics here and there and put them into their games as well. But back when this released, the idea of a farming game, let alone a farming RPG, as it were, it was very strange. Like, I mean, you think of it now, and like James was saying, this isn't what I think regular people would think of when they think of video games, right? Especially not in 1996. But it was a game that sort of let you develop your own sense in that way that you were developing. It's your farm. You're going to build it how you want, and you're going to interact with these villagers, in the very limited capacity you could in the original game and as it developed further on. But just to hit the highlights on the original, what we're seeing here is, the very beginnings of what would become Harvest Moon. Like, you'll see certain things in here that you'll see in other games in the series, obviously much more developed. I think the biggest thing, at least for me, and Ozzy, I'd like to get your opinion on this, and James as well, since you guys have played the games. I think the biggest thing that I found that was sort of developed later on is the fact that you still, in the original, you still do all these tasks, but there doesn't seem to be like an energy meter or something that sort of limits what you can do and when you can do it. And so there's not that big sense of like, I have a limited amount of actions that I can take every single day. So I need to make sure that I do the most important things that I need to do every day.
Yeah, I played the original one after actually playing Back to Nature.
Okay.
And I played it on an emulator. And it has all the elements there that would eventually become the game that we know and love. But it still, in my mind, was not as fully developed. It was much more of an RPG at that point.
Okay.
It was much more structured than what the games ended up becoming later on. And so, for whatever reason, I just didn't find the same sense of excitement and control that I liked in the games because I was so used to the later ones. And so I think it's a very, very good start. I think it's a good game. It looks completely different from the other ones. I mean, in terms of its sprite-based graphics.
Yeah.
But it is, I would say the most dated one. I'm not talking about, whether it's the better one. I mean, there are a ton of other games that could potentially be, worse, but it's not, it's a game that reflects its age. And I think at the time, Victor was probably wondering, how can we sell this? How can we best develop this while still being an RPG?
Yeah.
And I think you kind of find that compromise in the first one where not a lot of the things that we would eventually come to know are there.
Yeah. I will say that one of the things that has always stood out to me about Harvest Moon is that I've always really enjoyed their art style, and their graphic style, the way they present things.
In the early games.
Yes, I thought has always been very appealing. Like, it just looks nice, right? It looks inviting in a sense. It makes me want to sort of sit down and be this farmer and, get to, raise all my animals and do all my crops and stuff like that.
It really goes along with the theme of being like this happy thing that's encouraging and inviting, like you were saying, like the Friends of Mineral Town, if I can say it. It's like this very, very cute art style, and it just makes you want to play it just looking at the game. And like when you pick up your little dog and like toss it on the ground, it somehow loves you. It's great. It's like, what is better than this?
Let's talk about the art style for a moment. I mean, I think it is a very kind of cutesy anime, almost chibi style. And I think that, I mean, in the early games, I thought it was very nice. It was very pretty. It kind of developed into something really weird and strange that I didn't quite like because it moved away from its kind of like anime roots in a way. But I think the art style is actually one of the big issues with people, and getting into the game. Yeah. I think people see the art style and they say, this is either A, a game for kids, or B, a game for girls, however unfair that may be as an assessment. And I think, in a sense, I do always get the sense that Harvest Moon is a game that's been identified with a female demographic. And so, boys per se, they see this game as something that they shouldn't be playing. You should be slaying monsters or something, as James said. And I think the art style doesn't do it any favors. I wouldn't want to change it, and I wish that they would go back to the original art style. Yeah. But I think that was probably one of the big reasons why people just had a hard time. And over time, it got more cutesy without getting more, aesthetically pleasing. And I think that was kind of what did it in, like something like Tree of Tranquility or Animal Parade or something like that. I mean, it's not that the art style is bad, it's just that it looks generic. But it still looks cute, like something that a boy, quote unquote, wouldn't play. And I think that it's a good point to make that the art style in this game probably has a lot to do with whether people give it a shot or not.
So I have a question. I don't know if this is bringing up too big of a topic, but you said it's kind of geared towards girls in some sense, and I get you there because it's definitely a very cute looking game, and it's like, no, this is a girl game, farming and making relationships and all this sort of stuff. But something that struck me as interesting looking through the history of the game, they've had a very,
I know exactly what you're about to say.
They've had a very weird history with the sex you're allowed to choose, the gender you're allowed to choose. That sounds better. Like in the game. So for example, there's Friends of Mineral Town where you can only be a boy. And then they release more Friends of Mineral Town where you can play the girl. And then there's, there's Harvest Moon DS. And then there's Harvest Moon DS Cute, which is the one where you can play a girl. And this is multiple times that it happens this way.
Even coming back to Nature, there is a Japan only version that's called like Back to Nature, Harvest Moon for Girl, I think is what it was called.
I think that's probably, it plays a big part, the fact that I think, at the time, more boys played games than girls did, I think. And so that's why they probably started out with the male version. Mm-hmm. But I also think part of that is the distinction between Natsume and Victor, then eventually Marvelous over there in Japan, and how they handled it. Natsume, it seemed like they just kind of focused on the boy version. They were not going to go through the trouble of translating two versions. But in Japan, the first time that we saw, them trying to do something where you could pick a boy or a girl was, I think, in the Game Boy Color games. It was either the second or the third one. I think it was the third one. Actually, the third one actually came in two separate cartridges, one for boy and one for girl. So you could buy either or, kind of like Pokemon.
Amazing.
I think in Japan, they've been a lot more cognizant of trying to make it appeal to both sides, whereas here in the US, it's kind of, I think, a matter of being pragmatic, that they're just like, well, we don't really have the capability to port two games, and so we're just going to go with the one that may appeal to the broadest demographic, because a girl will still play a game, in which they're a boy, because there are just not that many games that are geared towards them. But a boy may have a much harder time playing a game that's with a girl. So again, I'm making generalities here, but I'm kind of putting myself in the mentality of a 12-year-old boy.
Also in the mentality of, when these games are coming out, like...
Yeah, exactly. And so I do think that, and I think I've read it in points, is that, these are games that are very, very popular, with women. There's something about this game that speaks to women. And, without generalizing, I think it's the lack of violence. I think it's a lack of, kind of conflict. I think that really, makes it a much more peaceful experience. I wish that, from the beginning, they had been more egalitarian in a way with letting you choose a boy or girl, but at the same time, I mean, it's already a hard enough concept as it is to implement. And then you have to sell the publisher on like, okay, well, we're also going to implement a girl here. So I'm not going to give them too much grief for it.
I mean, despite, whatever shortcomings the original release and some of the subsequent releases may have had, I think what the original release did that was extremely important was that it showed that this gameplay loop was fun and it was addictive. You know, when on the surface of it, like you were saying, James, if you just told somebody what this game was like, they'd probably be like, okay, don't really get it. But when you sit and you play it and you do it, that's when you realize like, oh, this is fun. Like, I want to keep doing this. And I think because of that, the original Harvest Moon, apparently, I don't have any exact numbers, but just from anecdotal evidence of people talking about it, it seems that it sold a good amount of units, especially for, a new concept from, a developer that I don't think up to this point had a lot of, or at least not the developer, a publisher that I don't know if they were very well known outside of Japan. I don't know what Natsume's publishing history was prior to Harvest Moon, but it was also reviewed fairly well, which set the stage for the rest of the games that we're going to be talking about. Moving on from that, I think the next entry that we want to talk about is Harvest Moon 64. There was a Game Boy re-release of the original Harvest Moon, but it's just the original Harvest Moon on Game Boy. So the N64 entry is really the next big entry that we see. Again, developed by Victor. And they started, sort of playing around and expanding stuff from there. Obviously, this is Harvest Moon's first foray into the third dimension. I should say that more dramatically, like third dimension, and then have Paul add an echo or something. Exactly. Even though they do have an isometric camera, which is, I don't know, it's kind of weird watching people play Harvest Moon 64. Like, it works, but I don't know, the camera feels a little weird to me, the way it's set up.
If you don't have the background with it, then it may look weird, but it didn't to me at the time, and because I played it at the time, it doesn't to me either. I mean, and I think as I was speaking with you offline, I think that Harvest Moon 64 and Back to Nature kind of go hand in hand, because they were basically variations of the same concept. You have to save your farm. You're going back to your farm and you have to save it. And, they Back to Nature added a number of things, but basically it was almost like a port of 64, but with a different look a little bit and just more things added to it. Yeah. So it's not unfair to speak of these games in tandem.
Yeah, I mean, I think it had a lot of the same character models, if I'm correct with that.
If I'm not mistaken, based on what I know, the characters in Back to Nature are the characters from 64. They just have like different backstories and somewhat different personalities.
Yeah, that was super interesting to me, because it's like I didn't play 64, but I imagine if I had and then went to play Back to Nature, it's like, wait, you go into the store or you talk with this person who you're used to having this certain personality, and they're totally different, or they have a different story. It's like, what? But they look the same. What is going on?
Yeah, if I had to take a guess, obviously speaking straight out of my ass, I'd have to assume that part of it was maybe that because they had more space to work with on the PlayStation as opposed to the N64 cartridges, maybe they felt like they could tweak things a little bit and add new things and try to make it a newish experience instead of just being a straight port of 64 onto the PlayStation.
I can buy that. Yeah, I would see that. I know that the 64, the limitations of the cartridge format were really pronounced. Yeah. And it's a game that, if I recall from reviews back in the day, kind of really shrugged a little bit.
Yes.
So it was a little bit muddy, which, again, saying Nintendo 64 and mud in the same sentence is a redundancy.
Yeah. It was one of those games where, like you said, Ozzy, the criticisms, at least that I found, were mostly like the soundtrack seemed to be a little repetitive, and there were some visual issues. Like there were a little bit of glitchy visuals sometimes and things like that. But the gameplay kind of really just makes up for it. Like, people really like Harvest Moon 64 and Back to Nature, just have like a lot of love from fans of the Harvest Moon series. Well, it all depends on how you came into it. I mean, you either had a 64 back in the day or you had a PS1. Yep. And so if you had a 64, then you played it that way, or if you had a PS1, you had to play it the other way. And so this was the entry point for most people. That's right. I feel like at the time that the original came out in 96, that Super Nintendo was already on its way out. And that's a big part of the reason why that cartridge goes for so much money nowadays, because there just was a limited amount of cartridges that were sold. But with Back to Nature and 64, they were still, they were released when those systems were still in, a pretty good peak. I mean, I don't know if the 64 ever had a peak, but I'm gonna stop.
So much hate.
No, but it's really, it all depends on, it's kind of like they say, whichever, Doctor Who you see first, that's gonna be your doctor. Like, that's exactly how it is. Whichever Harvest Moon you played first, that's gonna be your Harvest Moon. And for a lot of people, that was 64 and Back to Nature.
Yeah. What's your favorite Pokemon game? The first one I played.
Yeah.
It's and it really is, comes down to that. I will say a lot of I give credit to 64 for a lot of these things just because it came out first, but whatever. I mean, 64 was the first one to have the limited amount of time for work in a given day, and it had the stamina bar that becomes standard, I think, for Harvest Moon games going forward, where basically every action you take in the game costs you stamina. And then when you're out in the field and when you're not in a building in town, time is passing. And so you have to sort of deal with those two things in tandem.
It's interesting that you mentioned the soundtrack, though, because I don't know about you, James, but Harvest Moon are not games that I necessarily associate with a soundtrack. I have the menu music for Back to Nature is stuck in my head forever. Like I will always, I will never forget that menu music. But for the most part, when you play a Harvest Moon game, you're not listening to music.
No.
You're basically listening when I'm trying to think of the sounds that I'm hearkening back now to when I used to play it. It's just the steps, the steps of you kind of walking and kind of, tilling the earth and doing things, but never music
It's more the sound effects instead of the
it was just
sound
the sound effects. The sound effects was big. It's what I remember.
I think for
most.
me, I do remember songs, but it's like 4 songs because you have, I think there's a different one for each season, if I'm remembering right, at least for Friends of Mineral Town. And those are like constantly just playing in the background. And I think in some ways they just start to blend into the background because it's like constantly on repeat. So maybe that's kind of like why all those other things stand out to you, like the steps and the tilling with the hoe and all that sort of stuff.
No, but in Back to Nature, I think that you don't have
really?
that.
Okay.
I mean, because I did play Friends of Mineral Town, and that one does have music playing in the background, but Back to Nature doesn't.
So that's new to me. That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I will need to play it again, but I think that's how.
Don't do it. Don't do it. You've come so far.
For example, like I always remember when you woke up and it was a rainy day. Those were days that I was like, okay, well, today I have to figure out what to do, and there will be no music, just the rain. But hey, maybe I'm just speaking out of my ass. Maybe there is music, and I just don't remember.
Right. That's super interesting though that they kind of changed that later on, because even though it does kind of blend in, it's like you get these tunes stuck in your head, and it like the moment I hear that song, it like brings me right back to playing that game. So that's interesting that it wasn't, at least as far as you remember, it wasn't an addition or it wasn't something they had in that game.
Yeah.
64 also, I think, as we just discussed, features 4 seasons, and I thought this was cool because I don't know, I don't remember seeing this on games at that time, but the 4 seasons aren't just for show. Like each season features its own specific weather patterns, and it affects which crops you can grow during any given season. And
there are some crops that just don't grow in certain seasons.
Exactly, which I thought was a nice little touch. Like it's sort of those little things with Harvest Moon, those little details that really like put you in that world. Like what Ozzy was saying, like make you feel like you're a part of that sort of environment and that farm and that town. And so that was one of the ones that I thought was really cool.
Well, it really forced you to plan ahead, for example. I mean, when you had winter coming up, first of all, you have 30 days. The seasons last 30 days. Okay. And so you have to basically harvest everything before the season's through, because otherwise your crops are going to go bad.
Yeah.
And so you're forced to plan ahead, but also you need to plan ahead for the winter, because, and even before into the winter, like you can't buy a bunch of seeds on the 28th that are only going to grow in the summer.
Yeah.
And so it's a lot of management in terms of what you get and what you don't get. And with respect to winter, you can't really harvest in winter. You can't grow anything in winter. And so it forces you to find other ways to try to make your money. And so that's usually where you go into the mine. And for those of you that haven't played it, there's a mine, beside your farm that you go into, and just you go deeper and deeper and deeper.
Yep.
Trying to find ores, etc., and then selling them.
Yep.
And so you have to find other things. And at least with the mine, I remember when it was winter, I would see, okay, how long can I go? How low can I go? Because you're using stamina all the while. And it wasn't just one time when I woke up in the hospital because I had just exhausted myself to death and I had taken, one sweep too much. And so I don't know. I mean, you had to plan ahead. You had to get, make some food, or you had to buy some food, and then go into the mines and then watch, your time, etc. I mean, whenever you're inside, time doesn't run.
Yeah.
And so it only runs when you're outside. But still, what good is time if you don't have any stamina? Yeah. If you don't have any stamina, that's it. It's your day might as well be done. The only thing you can do is just go about your the town and speak to others. And so it really gave a different feel to every single season.
Something I'm curious about, Ozzy, in terms of Back to Nature, with the stamina, I know, at least from what I remember playing recently from Friends of Mineral Town, there wasn't an actual stamina bar, like visual, but there was still a stamina bar kind of in the background where like like every so many hits your character like sits on the ground and it's like yawning or something and then slowly your face turns blue. Is that a similar sort of thing?
That's adorable.
That's exactly how it
gotcha.
is. Yeah, that's I don't remember any one of the games having a specific bar. It's just there are visual indicators that you're exhausting yourself. Usually it's the guy just like wipes the sweat off his forehead, etc.
Some of the games did have a bar, but I know for a fact that I think Back to Nature specifically might have been the first one to do it, where it was like you said, there's no bar, but you can visually see like your character becoming tired, so it shows you how to identify like when you're going too much. One thing I did enjoy about Back to Nature because I had never played it, but I like the story aspect where it also sets, aside from all these other little time limits, there's the overarching time limit in that you've inherited your grandfather's farm, but the citizens of the town don't trust you. So they're like, if you can restore this farm in 3 years, you can keep it. Otherwise, you have to leave, which I find hilarious because, first of all, it's my farm. You can't tell me to do that. But the other thing is I like that it sort of incentivizes the player, because if you do restore it, if you get it up to the level you need to in 3 years, then you can keep playing forever. But if you don't, then they just game over you after 3 years. And I can't imagine being that kid who put those 3 years in and for some reason just wasn't able to get himself organized enough to do it and then be like, and then you had to leave, and now you have to start all over again.
Yeah, but it's funny that you mentioned that because it's not something that I even thought about when I was playing the game. Like, it's kind of something that they tell you, the mayor tells you right at the beginning, but it just kind of went over my head. And the locals are so friendly that you don't even realize it. So when you see it in a description or something like that, it looks bad or it looks silly, but it doesn't ever feel that way. At least I didn't even realize that you would get kicked out because the townsfolk didn't like you, until I read this outline, to be quite frank. And then I actually took out the game and I went into the booklet and I read, the background, and I was like, oh, they're right. Yeah, they will kick you out. So I confirmed that, that really does happen, that they will kick you out if
the mayor also looks like a complete dork with his hat, so it's like, are you really paying attention to what he says when he's talking to you?
He's an adorable dork.
He is an adorable dork.
I will say, this is a question I wanted to ask both of you really quickly. What is it, because you've both played the game, so James, I want to ask you first, what is the aspect of that sort of loop, that gameplay loop in Harvest Moon that you like the most, or that you find yourself coming back to? Like, is it the crops? Is it the animals? Like, is it the mine? Like, what do you find most engaging about it?
Interesting question. I think for me, it's like what draws me in right off the bat is the farm and farming elements, because it's easy to see kind of the benefits that you're reaping. It's like the moment you take in those turnips the first time and get money the next day, it's like, okay, yeah, this is awesome. My farm's looking better. And then I think the social aspect is kind of what keeps me around, because the farming at a certain point, it starts to either get really easy and you're getting just a ton of money from it and money's less of an issue, or whatever it is, or maybe you get bored of that whole mechanic. But the social aspect is cool because you're growing your relationships with all these people in the town, and you feel connected with the people in the town in a certain way. And it's so weird to say for a game like this that looks so cutesy, and it's like, oh, how do you feel connection with Ellie or Anne or whatever it is? But it's like, as you get to know them and have these small little cutscenes learning about their lives, that's the part that has kind of kept me in the loop after kind of the main loop of farming and stuff.
Okay. What about you, Ozzy?
I think I've already said it. I mean, I think the idea of just going the next day and seeing what the next day brings me, what can I grow? Will my corn finally yield fruit? And, will I make a ton of money? Or will I be able to, cut enough wood in order to expand my kitchen or something like that? I remember, back in the day, me and my cousins, what we wanted the most was just to expand the house, and we were all trying to kind of go for it. And so, eventually down the line, you can even build a greenhouse, etc. And so it's the idea of, it's almost like the American dream. It's like you can build it yourself and you can make something out of your farm. And beyond that, it's just kind of like the developing the relationships of finally hoping to see whether you're going to be able to woo one of the eligible bachelorettes, etc. Is it going to be Potpourri? Is it going to be Karen? Is it going to be Ellie? It's an interesting.
What did you call my wife? Potpourri? I call her Potpourri. Maybe I'm
Potpourri.
Maybe I'm pronouncing it wrong.
I call it Potpourri.
That's amazing. So I think before we take our next break, which we'll be taking right now, I did want to highlight one thing, because we've talked about 64 and Back to Nature sort of in tandem, and I think Ozzy's right. I think they do kind of go hand in hand. But one thing I found really interesting was this quote from GameSpot's Gerald Villoria, who basically said of Back to Nature, and I quote, "Surprisingly, one of the most satisfying role-playing experiences to be found on the PlayStation." That quote kind of stuck with me, because when you think of, especially in the year 2000, like the RPG experiences that were available on the PlayStation, that's not a small compliment. That I think that says a lot about that sort of really satisfying gameplay mechanic that Harvest Moon's developed, and how it can really become something that you sort of become engrossed in, and you sort of feel like you're part of that world for a little bit. That I think that says a lot about what it is and what those developers were able to accomplish.
I think, with Harvest Moon, is if it clicks for you, you get it. You really know what makes it such a great, experience. There are people that will not give it a chance, or there are people that just do not have the patience or the mentality to really get into it.
Yeah.
But I think it stands on its own with other experiences on the system. And it's funny, because I think that the Harvest Moon games came at a time where, in the PS1, there were a few games that were trying to do something like this, like Aquanaut's Holiday, or there's another one where, like, you spend the summer in the countryside. I forgot the name of it right now. Okay. But kind of like these slice of life games that just played a lot slower. And I think that you really started seeing that with the PlayStation 1. And I think it was probably its peak. There were some in the PS2 era as well, particularly with the Animal Crossing games on the GameCube, etc.
Yeah.
But I do think that there was a desire for people to play a game that did not involve conflict.
Yeah.
And this was a good alternative to that.
Mm-hmm. All right. And with that, I think we're going to take another quick break, and we'll come back with Harvest Moon Friends of Mineral Town. That sound good?
Sounds good.
Yep.
We're back. All right. So first things first, I do want to say we've been really focusing on the console ports the console Harvest Moon games. There's also, kind of in tandem with the console releases, Harvest Moon has always had like a strong lineup of portable games. And weirdly enough, I want to get your guys' opinion on this real quick. I've always felt like Harvest Moon games feel better portable. Like, it's the kind of game that I kind of want to have on the go, as opposed to sitting in my house and playing them, if that makes any sense.
Well, I think that Friends of Mineral Town proved it.
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, that game was Back to Nature, but in portable format. And it played quicker since it didn't have the loading times, etc. It was just a much snappier game.
Yeah.
I think there are games that lend themselves very well to a pick up and play, where you just do one day and then you're good. And so that's why I think the Game Boy Color games, I mean, the first one was just on regular Game Boy.
Yep.
And that one came out in 98.
Yep.
And then, Harvest Moon 2 on Game Boy Color in 2000 and Harvest Moon 3 and Game Boy Color in 2001. Yep. I always wanted to play these games originally because when I was playing Back to Nature, the Game Boy Advance was not really a thing. It was a year before it would be released.
Yeah.
And so you had the Game Boy Color and people were playing Pokemon. And I was like, look, I'd rather play Harvest Moon than Pokemon. Even though I was playing Pokemon Blue at the time.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think they're games that lend themselves very well to the portable format. And these games in particular, the Game Boy Color games, you know, without getting into too much of them because there's really not a lot to say, they all have their own feel. The first game is kind of just a straight port of the Super Nintendo one. But the second and the third one just kind of have, you know, a different... I don't know. I don't know how else to say it. Just
they have a je ne sais quoi.
Yeah, like the third one, for example, I mean, it takes place on an island, and so you have to wait for like the ferry schedule in order to go to town and stuff, which makes it feel completely different. And you can snowboard, for example, and they have a different story from the other ones. I mean, with the third one, it's kind of like you're helping, you know, another, you know, girl that just inherited a farm, you know, or just bought a farm to, you know, develop the farm, etc., or something like that.
I see. Okay.
So, I don't know. It's just nice that they put a lot of effort into the Game Boy Color games. And I would recommend, I mean, if you want to play a portable one, I would say Friends of Mineral Town is probably the way to go.
Yeah.
But you're also not being unreasonable if you played, you know, Harvest Moon 3 on Game Boy Color. What are your thoughts on the Game Boy games? James, did you ever play those?
No, just the Game Boy Advance, not the normal Game Boy games. No. But yeah, I looked at them. Okay. I do agree. They do look quite a bit different from Friends of Mineral Town and Back to Nature and all that sort of stuff. So it's interesting hearing about them from you since you've played some of those.
Yeah. I mean, I played the first one was probably the one I played the most.
Yeah.
But the second and third one, I just kind of popped them in to see, because at the time I already had Friends of Mineral Town, so it was like, okay, I'm not going to take a step back, you know, into a game, because, for example, the second one or the first one don't have any of the social aspects, so you can't really marry anyone, and it's like, that's the reason why I play this game. So why would I go back to those?
I mean, I think also for me, the adorable art style comes through much better on the tiny Game Boy sprites than it did in 3D. So I think I also appreciate that aspect of it as well. But yeah, like I said, you know, and let's just get to it, because this is the one, you know, Friends of Mineral Town. Here's the thing. When I've heard people talk about Harvest Moon, this is usually the game that ultimately they're like, this is the best one. I don't know how true that is, but based on just what I've heard, and in my research as well, it just sounds like this is the one that people really took to, that really grabbed people. I think because it seems to have taken the elements of all the previous games and just sort of refined them and made them like the best iteration of what they've ever been. So
yeah, I mean, I don't think that that's incorrect. I think that, you know, it's a game that really benefited from, it was a more simplified art style from the Back to Nature games.
Yeah.
The Back to Nature games, one of the issues that you have with the isometric camera, and both that and 64, is that sometimes it was hard to position your character.
Yeah.
And sometimes the crops, you would plant them in a wrong way because you just had difficulties with the way that the angle was set in the isometric sense. And so Friends of Mineral Town, what it did was, it was kind of like the Super Nintendo, where it was just a straight overhead camera. And that made it easier to plant your crops, to water your crops, and to move around. And so it made for a smoother playing experience than Back to Nature. I will always have a soft spot for Back to Nature, and that will be my preferred game. But Friends of Mineral Town, I think it really streamlined a lot of the things that were wrong with 64 and Back to Nature.
Yeah. And I think here's something that I've heard, and I agree with it. I played Back to Nature very briefly, but one of the things that I really liked about it, it's like a little quality of life thing, but I think it does a lot, is, we haven't really talked about this, but when you play these Harvest Moon games, generally you start off with 5 tools: the axe, the hammer, the watering can, the sickle, and the hoe. And you use them to do all the different stuff around your farm. Now, for example, in the Super Nintendo version of the game, like the first one, the way you would change between these tools is you'd have a shed, and you'd have to go into your shed, and you'd pick one tool, and then you'd go out and you use it, and then you have to run back into your shed and change your tool. You'd have to do that every single time. And
I remember thinking that this was the reason why I just didn't get into it.
I could definitely see that. And then in the 64 version, I remember they improved it by you being able to have all of your tools on you at once, but every time you wanted to change a tool, you had to pause the game and then pick a tool and then select it and then unpause the game. In Friends of Mineral Town, they make it so you can just switch tools on the fly. And it makes it because the farming and the tools are something that you use all the time, that little change makes a world of difference, I think, because it sort of cuts down on a lot of the chaff of you having to sort of go through all these steps. It's just like, I'm using this tool, now I switch real quick, water my plants, now I'm using the hoe to till the soil, now I'm planting seeds, and it just makes it like a much more engaging experience when you don't have to constantly stop, switch around things. Now I'm doing this one thing. Yeah. Now I'm doing this other. So that's what I'm talking about when I say like it refined those sort of gameplay mechanics and made it a much more engaging experience for the player.
So James, how do you first experience this game? How do you come about?
How did I come back? Dude, that's a great question. You're asking me these questions about like back in the day. I honestly don't know how I came upon it. I heard that it was good and I think I just picked it up, and it was just one of those things that I figured I would try out. And
yeah, just to get a sense, how old were you around the time?
Oh man, you're putting me on the spot.
You don't have to say your age.
I kind of think I was older when I played this, like maybe high school.
Okay. So this came out in 2003.
I think I was. So I don't think I played it when it came out, because in 2003 I was 9. 2003, I was 9.
Yeah.
Oh, you're younger.
He's younger than me, which makes me very
happy.
Okay.
But I think I played it in junior high or high school originally, and then I came back to it again recently a few months ago. But yeah, the first time I played it, I think was junior high or high school. I have such a foggy memory about gaming during that time, though.
No worries. I mean, I know that there are some stages in your life in which everything just seems to be in a haze. So I don't fault you for that.
Yeah.
Let me just mention my experience. I mean, I actually, like I said, I had stopped playing Back to Nature, and but I always had a very big obsession with Harvest Moon. And so when the PS2 game came out, which was Save the Homeland, Save the Homeland.
Okay.
Which we'll talk about later. Yeah. I was very disappointed by that game. And so I said, okay, well, maybe Harvest Moon is just not for me anymore. But then the Game Boy Advance came out, and I had the original Game Boy Advance, the one that wasn't backlit, which made it a mission to play games because it was very, very difficult.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did you not buy the worm light, the required
No, I didn't
accessory?
Buy the worm light. I wasn't that flush with cash. And so I remember I bought the game, and I played it, and I remember being so obsessed with it that I took it with me everywhere. And it was December of 2003, and we were going to go on a trip to California to visit some family. And I remember I told my Mom, I can't find my Game Boy. And she's like, what's wrong with that? It's like, I can't leave without my Game Boy. And I remember my mother went all the way to Toys R Us. God, I'm thinking, I associate Harvest Moon with Toys R Us all the time. That's the thing, because I bought all my Harvest Moon related things there. And she literally went and she bought me a brand new Game Boy Advance, a black one, just so that I could play Harvest Moon. And let me tell you, I took that Harvest Moon to California, and I think I played more Harvest Moon than I was out or doing anything. I mean, I had a lot of fun. That was the first time I snowboarded for the first time in my life. But I was still just like, spending until I was also jet lagged. Yeah. And so I would spend until like the early, morning hours just playing Harvest Moon. And I had to have the light on because otherwise I couldn't see. Yeah. But I just remember having so much experiences with it. So I call it my relapse. That's what Friends of Mineral Town was, where I was just back into my old habits. Yeah. And I eventually had to let it go because I was realizing that it was just taking over my life. And I was about to, I was just entering high school. It was like I was entering 9th grade.
Gotcha.
And so I just had to focus on school. And I was like, all right, I'm gonna put this down because otherwise it's just going to take my life away.
I personally had a clear purple Game Boy Advance, which I always thought was the coolest one.
That's the one I had before. That's
I know,
the one
it's the best
I
one.
couldn't find. And then I found it, by the way, and so I had two
Nice.
Game Boy Advances.
Yes.
I think the most
That's a
confusing
win-win.
thing about your story was that you said you snowboarded in California. You must have been up at Shasta or something. But
Yes, I actually went to Big Bear.
Okay.
Big Bear Lake, which is one of their big
Interesting.
peaks.
Yeah.
Kind of along like the Lake Tahoe area or whatever.
So you were playing Harvest Moon in like this gorgeous expanse of
I love
nature.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I can definitely
Absolutely.
see how those two things would come together.
Well, that's why, to me, the particular games, I have very particular feels about them.
Yeah.
And Back to Nature, I associate it with being in the city, but being in the countryside at the same time. Whereas Friends of Mineral Town, for me, what I associate with it was the first time I ever saw snow.
Interesting.
Because that was the first time I ever did see snow. And so I was literally in the middle, like, of nowhere, in this mountain resort, in a log cabin, playing Harvest Moon with hot chocolate. Like, you can't get better than
That's
that.
awesome.
Come on, man.
Yeah.
And so I have very good memories of this game.
I think I was gonna say one thing I really like about this game that in my mind, you might be comparing it to like Back to Nature or something like that. In my mind, since I came back to this after Stardew Valley, I'm always comparing it to Stardew Valley, and something I found super interesting with this game as opposed to that game was the whole rival system. I don't know how you guys kind of felt about that, but that was something that I came back to it as like, oh, this is kind of cool. It's like an additional element to the relationship system where it's not just me leveling up my hearts with these people, but it's like I have someone who's my rival in this relationship. I don't know how you guys felt about that.
Yeah, I didn't even realize that, to be honest. I mean, I knew that some of them were they were interested in, let's say, Ellie or something like that. The doctor, for example, is interested in Ellie, but I just thought like, oh, okay, yeah, he's cool. He's into her. That's pretty cool. I wasn't thinking like he's my rival and I had to beat him to death.
You just bludgeon him to death with your hoe one day.
That would change the tone
Wait,
of
what'd you
Harvest
call
Moon.
Ellie? What do you, okay, anyways, keep going.
No, what I was gonna say is
I was cool with the doctor until he told me he liked Ellie.
yeah, and then it was on like Donkey Kong.
That's right.
One of the things that I found super interesting about that is just the fact that honestly, it really seems like the developers of Harvest Moon, whenever they want to innovate on something, they're like, let's take this one thing that people like and let's just add some sort of like time restriction to it. Because I think if you don't marry somebody within a certain amount of time, they marry one of the rivals, don't they?
I think that's how it works.
Because you have an option. You have
Yeah.
an option to not choose to marry anyone even. So then everybody will be happy and you'll just be tilling the fields by yourself forever.
Yeah, I mean, that's...
You will be an eligible bachelor for the rest of your life.
correct.
Is this...
yeah.
So I have a question. I never tried this. Is this one of those games where you can like level up the hearts with everyone and start dating all of them? Basically all the eligible bachelorettes? I never tried that.
No. You can upgrade. You kind of have to play the field a lot, man.
of course.
I mean, you kind of have to see who is working out best for you.
Yeah.
So let me get into one of the aspects that we haven't talked before is that the games come, in the booklet with a calendar that tells you all the birthdays. And
nice.
In order to develop relationships, you have to kind of check, okay, whose birthday is it today? And so, sometimes you may forget, like, oh, snap, like today I was so busy that I forgot to get a birthday. Or you may not have bought anything and the stores may be closed so that you can't really get a gift for anyone. Or the gift that you can get is something that they absolutely hate. It's like, oh, why are you giving me turnips? I did. So, you kind of have to play the field. You have to kind of think, okay, who is kind of being more responsive to me? And it's kind of interesting because over time, you may be more interested in bachelorettes, let's say, that you weren't as interested in at the beginning. But as you start getting to know them, you're like, but Puri is actually kind of nice. She's kind of bubbly and, happy. And I think I was trying to woo Karen, that's who I think I was trying to go for.
She's
in
a
Back to
babe.
Nature.
Yeah. That's fair.
Yeah.
I will say
But,
one of the...
so you can't really do all of them, but you can kind of see who is kind of working out the most and kind of focus on those.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to ask you guys is What do you think? Because we've talked a lot about the whole social aspect of Harvest Moon. So like going to town, talking to villagers, getting to know them, sort of, vying for some of the bachelorettes' affections and stuff like that. What do you think of the implementation of these kinds of social aspects, specifically in RPGs like Harvest Moon? Because I think nowadays we see much more of it than we used to before. I think there were always games that had some sort of, maybe not a dating sim aspect to it, but maybe like a social thing where you would interact with party members or you'd interact with NPCs and stuff like that, and they'd have some sort of effect. But Harvest Moon really sort of dove headfirst into that. So was that something that always appealed to you, Ozzy, in terms of Harvest Moon? Like, were you into the social aspect of it from the beginning?
Come on, dude. I mean, we're a podcast that talks about Persona like every other episode. Like,
you hadn't played Persona when you were playing Harvest Moon.
Yeah, I wasn't playing Persona, but that was when I saw Persona and I saw that there was a social aspect.
Yeah.
It immediately brought me back to Harvest Moon. I was like, yeah, that's exactly what I want in a game. Okay. So yeah, absolutely. I love the social aspects of it.
Gotcha. What about you, James?
Yeah, kind of like I mentioned earlier, I think the social aspect kind of came later. My enjoyment of it, because for me it was just about making money. It was about min-maxing my days to get the best farm, the prettiest farm, the nicest house, and all that sort of stuff. And kind of making friends with people came secondary. And that sounds really mean, but it's like
a true man of
like
of
a
the
true
farm.
man of the farm. Yes. But I think what kind of brought me into the social aspect was those little cutscenes that you eventually start getting, and it makes you feel more special in the game because it's not just like this farm tycoon anymore. You feel like a part of the town, and I think that's part of the purpose is it's trying to make you feel like you're part of this town, that you're making it better and improving the people and the place around you. So I think I'm more into it now, and my wife's actually helped me with that because like with Stardew, she's super into the social aspect. Like she gets her hearts up with every single person in the town. And so like that encourages me because I see that she's having a lot of fun with that. And it's like, oh, that actually sounds really fun. So I've kind of learned to be more interested in that aspect, I think.
Yeah. That's awesome. One of the things I don't think we mentioned is that each season brings with it some sort of festival.
Yes.
And so there may be horse racing, or there's like a tomato throwing festival or something. And, when you see the calendar on the booklet, you see oh my God, it's a tomato festival. Like, what the hell is that? And it really makes you look forward to what's coming up. Yeah. So again, there's always something in the horizon with these games. There's always something that you're looking forward to. Yeah. Like maybe it's, I don't know, someone's birthday, and you're like, okay, maybe I'm finally gonna get the heart from black to purple or something like that. Just to explain, your relationship develops, and as they develop, it goes from like a black heart to like a red heart, the max or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, there's so many little things that you can do with these games that, and eventually some of the games, and including Friends of Mineral Town, I mean, you can marry and have a son, etc. And, that to me at the time was pretty big because it's like, okay, you can finally be an adult, which is something I'm moving away from as much as I can nowadays. Yep. But back then I really wanted it.
That's all you want. Yep.
For whatever reason. So yeah, there's just so much, to enjoy.
Just out of curiosity.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No.
I was going to say, so there's obviously a ton to do in these games. You can do the social aspect, you can mine, you can fish, you can do the farming. Does that ever become a stressful thing for you guys? Because I think I have to stay in the mindset of like, okay, I can't get every single thing done in this day because I'm limited by time and by energy. Is that something that is encouraging or stressful for you in these type of games?
I'm forever stressed by that. Stressed.
A little bit of both. I never find it to be like, okay, I'm tense. Yeah. It's more like, I gotta think about this, man. I'm not gonna be able to... Like, you have to set priorities. And I think this game is very good in developing that, a sense of priorities. Yeah. Like, okay, I can't I can't not water my plants. Like I have to water my plants. I have to water my crops. So that goes first. And then from that, it's like, okay, the games usually give you enough stamina to do the things that you need to do.
Yeah.
You know, like it's just a matter of managing your time.
Yeah.
And one of the things I remember, because time doesn't flow when you're inside a building, it's like I would try to dash from one building to the other just to like, you know, minimize the amount of time I would run.
Yeah.
And then I would pick up every chicken. I would pick up all the eggs. I think the most stressful thing for this game, honestly, is managing your rucksack. You know, that's, I think, the part where you really get stressed, because you have a lot of things to pick up and not enough room in your rucksack.
Yeah.
And so that's probably one of the biggest things that you want to improve right away, is just kind of expanding it so that it kind of takes away a little bit of the stress. Because, for example, I mean, let's say that you're really far deep into the mine, but you don't have any more space for the ores. Like, that's it. Even if you have stamina, you're going to have to go back. And so it's a lot of little systems that kind of make you always be kind of thinking about how to best go about things. And so there is a gameplay component here that's very critical, even if you're not really thinking of it as a game per se.
Yeah. For me, it's forever stressful. It's always stressful. But I think when it all comes together, it's like, it always feels like you're spinning a bunch of plates and you're always trying to keep all your plates up. But then the one day where it all comes together and you nail everything, and you like everything comes out exactly the way you want it to go, like that's when it's all worth it. Like that's the one that makes me like, all right, I guess I gotta keep going, because now I feel so good. Like I get this high from like today was the best day. Like I nailed everything. Everybody I wanted to talk to was super cool. I got all my crops. I did all my stuff. Like that's what it's all, for me at least. That's when all the stress is like worth it at that point.
So Arnie, should we talk about some of the later games, since I know we're short on time?
Yes. One last thing I wanted to say before we move on from Friends of Mineral Town real quick is that there is a remake coming for the Switch in 2019 in Japan, and it's supposedly going to come to the rest of the world. So
that completely changed the aesthetics of it. So I'm a little bit
it's like the newer aesthetic with the old sort of gameplay.
Yep, Story of Seasons reunion with Mineral Town. So somehow we were timely with this episode, accidentally, because I had no idea this was happening.
You're always timely with Harvest Moon. There's usually some Harvest Moon being released at some point in time in the year.
That's true. So, but yeah, so, you know, following up from Harvest Moon, we do see, you know, some of the subsequent games. Save the Homeland, which was released on the PS2.
And it was released before Friends of Mineral Town, as I mentioned.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
I just think that I just think that it's one that I kind of put to the side, because Friends of Mineral Town is kind of, you know, a continuation of Back to Nature. But at the same time, you know, Save the Homeland was one of the ones that really, you know, try to do something different with the series. And I was so looking forward to it. I mean, this was 2001. And in 2001, you had a lot of great games. We already said that 2001 was a great year. Yeah. And, you know, for me, one of the ones that I was looking forward to the most was Save the Homeland. And I don't know what it is about this game that just doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
I think it's the fact that it was an early PS2 game, and the graphics just lose all of their charm. Like the graphics and the art style that you were accustomed to in Back to Nature just kind of disappeared. And the game feels very gray and brown. And you feel very small. It's cel-shaded, but it's very simplistic looking. And the game doesn't have any voices or anything, so it feels weird when you're playing a 3D game. It's fully 3D. It was the first Harvest Moon that was fully 3D, where you could actually like spin the camera and everything.
Yeah.
And it just made it very cumbersome. You can actually get this game nowadays on the PlayStation Network, so if you want to try it out, you know, it's only like $9. It's actually also available on the PS4.
Yeah.
So it was a huge disappointment. I could not get past the second season in this game.
Oh, wow.
It felt very empty as well, you know, and it felt very weird to not have the people that I was accustomed to seeing, you know, in Back to Nature. And I don't know, for some reason, just the town didn't feel like that cohesive.
Yeah. Do you think that might have been a result of being like the first fully 3D one? Because I know we've talked about
absolutely.
before.
Yeah, absolutely. They were trying to figure things out. The camera was not great. It was very cumbersome to plant your seeds, which was an issue in Back to Nature.
It's a problem I have in my personal life. It was an issue for Save the Homeland for entirely different reasons, but all pertaining to the camera. Okay.
And I think they were just trying to figure out. I don't think that they were a developer with a lot of resources, and so I don't think that they were really able to make it a very graphically advanced game. And but I think more than anything, it's just the aesthetics were not to my liking. The game felt very empty. It felt very lifeless, weirdly enough. Yeah. And it made me feel sad, and that's not something I want to...
That's not what Harvest Moon should do.
I don't want to do that when I play a Harvest Moon game. Every other game, it felt lively. But this one just felt lonely, and I just did not take to that. It's one of the few games, and I hate to say it, but I turned it into GameStop. I then regretted it because I was like, you know what, I shouldn't have done that. Yeah. I should just have stayed with it, even if I didn't play it. Yeah. But I actually remember turning it into GameStop and just picking some other game because I was just like, I don't really like this. Yeah. That's when I thought that I was done with Harvest Moon.
I mean, following Save the Homeland comes the game that I'm actually the most curious about, the most... like the one I want to try the most, which is A Wonderful Life. Personally, I think I do own this on PS2, but if you're thinking about getting one version, I don't know what the qualitative differences are, but I will say the GameCube version has link cable support with Friends of Mineral Town. So if you own Friends of Mineral Town, you probably want to go with the GameCube one, just for the extra context.
Yeah, because Wonderful Life, the one on the PS2, was a special edition, so it added a few things. The problem is that it has some really, from what I hear, some really bad bugs. Okay. Like game-breaking bugs.
Ooh, okay.
And, they wouldn't be fixed. I think they were fixed in the PS4 or PS3 release.
Yeah, the PlayStation Network one.
Yeah. But if you're going to play it on the original system, like, buyer beware. Like, yeah, so that's, I would say the GameCube version is probably the best bet for you to try. And I will say that's the reason why I never played A Wonderful Life, because it came out on the GameCube first, and I didn't have a GameCube. And so it didn't come out on the PS2 until the PS2 was well on its way out. Yeah. So I didn't really have the opportunity to experience it. And by then I was also just interested in other things. I was playing Shadow of the Colossus and other games that, were more, in my nature at the time. Pardon the pun. So but it looks very interesting because you do play through the entire life of the character itself.
So this is what I wanted, because I heard James oohing when I was introducing this game, and I think you're sort of interested in the thing I'm interested about, which is what Ozzy just mentioned, that you can have a son and you raise him until adulthood. Your character actually dies at the end of this game. I'm
okay.
Fairly
Spoiler
certain.
Alert! Jeez, Arnaldo.
Sorry. Bleep that. But no, basically from what I've read, what happens is as you're raising your child, you have an impact on him by taking him to certain places, interacting with him in certain ways. And so at the end of the game, your child can choose one of 7 careers. I did not write them down. But there's only 2 that I guess quote unquote matter for gameplay, which is he can choose to become a farmer, can choose to become a rancher. If he chooses either of these careers, then you get to keep playing the game as your child. Though apparently you can never get married or you can't just keep doing it. If he chooses any of the other 5 careers, then I think the game ends at that point.
Musician, artist, scholar, athlete, scientist, I believe, are the other ones.
Yes. Yep. You are correct. And so
just don't let him become a lawyer, please.
And so that whole aspect to me is incredibly interesting because it sort of, it just takes you that one step further, right? Like before you had a kid, but now it's like you fully interact with this other character and you get to sort of have your own input on what they become. And I'm sure you can figure out certain things to make him choose one path or the other. But I think playing it for the first time and just going into it blind would be extremely interesting. I don't know if you had any specific thoughts on that,
I
James.
think what interested me about A Wonderful Life, if I'm remembering my research correctly, I think this is the one that kind of takes the whole game a step in a little bit more of a realistic direction. in terms of like, like with your cows, they stop producing milk after 40 days. They have like, you have to get a male cow.
So they have to put them down?
No, yeah, you don't have to kill them every 40 days, but you have to basically have, I think, a bull impregnate the cow to have them continue making milk. It's very, very intense.
It's not as graphic as it sounds. I think you just put the bull in the same area.
There's probably some hearts and stuff like that. They're very happy. They both, yes. But yeah, I think there's a lot more realistic elements. I think if I'm thinking of the right game, I think this is the one where you can only till and harvest one square at a time. In this one, I could be wrong, but they just kind of took a couple more realistic directions, and also the time counts up by seconds in this one, I believe, and it doesn't. This is one of the few games that doesn't stop indoors, so the time is always ticking, and you don't wake up every morning at 6 o'clock like the other games unless you have the alarm clock. So it kind of twists the setup of all the other Harvest Moon games a little bit in this one.
Yeah. And so then following A Wonderful Life, that's when, as Ozzy had alluded to way earlier in the episode, like you start to see, I think it did start with A Wonderful Life where they start breaking the standard Harvest Moon mold, but then you get Magical Melody on the GameCube and the Wii, Tree of Tranquility, Animal Parade, and I agree with Ozzy, like you start seeing a little bit of a decline in the quality, at least from my perspective. And obviously I haven't played that many Harvest Moon games, but at least from the research I did, it doesn't seem to be, they don't seem to be the most fondly remembered in the series. But
I don't think it's a matter necessarily of quality. It's just I think they changed the aesthetic.
Yeah.
The aesthetic component, the stories were different. And I think when you really get down to it, it's probably the fact that people were growing older, and it's just they started growing away from this game.
Yeah.
So it's hard for them to be interested in games that they never really had a fondness for. And it's also on the Wii, and the Wii was kind of a wasteland for a lot of games that could have been decent, but were on the Wii. And so they never really sold because people were not buying those games because they were fine with just Wii Sports.
Yep. And so following off of that, what we really see and where I think like the true impact and legacy of Harvest Moon lies is in the spin-offs and games that clearly are in some ways inspired by Harvest Moon. So we've talked about most of these: Rune Factory, Innocent Life, the futuristic Harvest Moon, Stardew Valley is obviously, I think, the biggest one at this point, just because it's so closely tied to Harvest Moon. Like it's so obviously an homage to Harvest Moon. And obviously it's a very, if I'm to believe what people have told me about it, it's a very good game, which I'm sure helps. And then,
it started out as a Harvest Moon spinoff.
Exactly.
Yeah, and then it just it was called the Fantastic Harvest Moon or a Fantasy Harvest Moon or something like that, and then they ended up just going with just Rune Factory.
Yeah, and then you see like in other games you see some aspects of Harvest Moon, like Animal Crossing is one that I know is not doesn't revolve around farming, but I can see some of, like, at least personally I can see some things that I recognize as Harvest Moon inspired in that game, like. Animal Crossing is one of Nintendo's biggest franchises at this point. So, like, people like this sort of stuff. Like, it's very clear now that even what started as a concept that was clearly very strange, like, has now evolved into something that people really, really enjoy in one form or another. And I guess I just want to ask you guys, like, looking back on Harvest Moon and what it did, what it's become, like, do we need more games like Harvest Moon, or do we have enough now? Like, is this a genre that needs to sort of continue on, or do the games we have now sort of take it to its ultimate conclusion? Ozzy, what do you think?
Why do you want to kill it, dude?
I don't want to kill it. I'm just saying, like...
No, yeah, of course. Okay. Of course we should have more games like this. I mean, we can always improve upon them. Okay. We can always bring them to a new generation and bring this kind of peaceful gameplay experience to new players.
Yeah.
I don't see why we ever need to move away from that. I just think that it would be good to... right now we have Stardew Valley. I think that's pretty much the best successor to Harvest Moon that you could have.
Yeah.
And it's bringing it to a new generation, and it's really become very well received, and people are, going through the same loop that we used to go through with Harvest Moon. And I think that's really a testament to how much love went into the game based on that nostalgia for the original game. So yeah, I think that, bring them on. I mean, I think that more and more people are coming to terms with the idea that this is something fun and that they should play, not, dismiss it just because it sounds like something that they're not accustomed to, or that it would not be fun.
Yeah.
We saw things like Farmville grow up on Facebook. There's something about farming that people just kind of take to.
Farming,
There's also Farming Simulator, which is completely different from Harvest Moon, but it's still Farming Simulator. So there's something about it that people kind of really connect with. The idea of kind of going back to your roots, of your ancestors, of having to raise your livestock, of raise your crops, etc. Grow your crops. It's something that speaks to us on a primal level, I think, and it's good for developers to tap into that.
Yeah. What about you, James? As you log in your 600th hour of Stardew Valley, do you think like more people need to experience games like this?
Absolutely to that. I personally think, in regards, this is going to sound super negative for a Harvest Moon episode. In regards to Harvest Moon as a franchise, as an IP, I think Harvest Moon can die, but I think this type of farming game, I totally agree with Ozzy. It should totally stick around. I think Stardew has proven that it's an amazing game, and it's kind of really made it available to the masses. You have something like My Time at Portia, which is kind of taking more of a Harvest Moon 3D aspect, and that seems to have been a really good game. You have other spin-offs like Graveyard Keeper. There's just so many games that, like you mentioned, have been inspired by the Harvest Moon style of game, and I'm all about the continual iteration and improving on that type of genre. But I think in terms of just Harvest Moon as a whole, it seems like that brand has gotten so convoluted and messed up at this point. It's like maybe them redoing Friends of Mineral Town will be an amazing game, and I hope that. But I think just the brand itself, because of all these split offs of the company and all that sort of stuff, they kind of just need a clean slate and to start over in making these types of games.
Yeah.
Yeah. And by the way, the remake of Friends of Mineral Town is coming next year. We don't know if we're going to receive it.
Yeah.
But we are receiving one of the, latest Story of Seasons games. Yep. And that's the Doraemon, which is the Japanese manga, an anime. There's a kind of crossover between Doraemon and the Story of Seasons, and that one is very much in the vein of Harvest Moon, but with Doraemon characters in it. Yeah. So that one is coming out in October of this year. I mean, so we're going to be very topical with this episode.
Yeah. I mean, for my part, just to wrap it up, like, I think any game that makes you smile like Harvest Moon does, like, I wasn't a Harvest Moon fan, but like I can't sit down and play this game and be upset. You know what I mean? Like it puts you in that mood. Like it's just enjoyable. Like even when things don't necessarily go your way, I don't think I've ever been angry playing a Harvest Moon game or a game like Harvest Moon. Like, and I think there's value in that, right? There's value in that sort of environment, that sort of gameplay that just puts you in a good mood and lets you relax and lets you feel a sense of accomplishment in creating something from nothing, which is what at the end of the day I think most Harvest Moon's games do. But I think you might be right, James, and I think the name Harvest Moon may not be what's best for it going forward, but maybe Story of Seasons will continue that quality that we expect from Harvest Moon, and other developers who played Harvest Moon, grew up loving that game, will make their own takes on it that we'll enjoy for years to come. So I'm hopeful that's what'll happen, and that Harvest Moon will be remembered very fondly.
Yeah.
So I think with that, we'll wrap it up, guys. So James, why don't you tell everybody where they can find you?
Yeah, the best place to find me is honestly on Instagram at Klutch Kitten Gaming, or you can search for my podcast, which is just Klutch Kitten Gaming Podcast. It's on pretty much every podcast app that you can find. So just search that, or you can go to my website, which is www.kkgpod.com.
Perfect. And if we haven't made it abundantly clear by now, please go listen to Klutch Kitten Gaming Podcast. It's an incredible podcast, especially if you're a Switch owner. If you're interested in indie games whatsoever, It's a great place to just go and, unlike our show, get a nice bite-sized overview of a game that you might be thinking about getting and sort of get a perspective on it that I think, James is generally very positive in his reviews, and I think you can trust his opinions on things in that he's quite fair, at least from the episodes I've heard.
If you also want to hear you also want to hear me review games that Arnaldo pushes on me, like Doki Doki Literature Club, that is the best place to go.
I know. That's the only branded content on the podcast is branded by me because I made him play it. But yeah, Ozzy, why don't you tell people where they can find us?
So, we have a website, hooray, that's regionfreegamers.com, and there you can find companion pieces to this episode like this one.
Sweet.
Where you can hear some of the songs that we play on the episode, and we give you some pictures and talk to you a little bit more about some of the things that we discuss on the episode. And we also have exclusive articles from people in the Instagram world, from other folks that are really into this hobby, and yours truly and other co-hosts. So make sure to check that out. If you want to talk to us, we're always on Instagram at Region Free Gamers Podcast, and also on Twitter at Region Free Gamer, not with an S because that's Twitter for you. But yeah, you can basically find us anywhere. And really, the website is kind of your one-stop shop for Region Free Gamers. So if you want to see what we're cooking up, definitely make sure to visit us there.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for listening. We love you all very much. Keep tilling your fields. Keep milking your cows. Keep shearing your sheep. Keep doing all that good stuff. Take care of each other. Love y'all. Peace.
Cheers.
Thank you. Every day, you kind of have to give your chickens a little bit of love.